Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, better known as JSSJ. The JSSJ graduate level certificate program in JEDI empowers professionals with invaluable skills, tools, and resources to connect generations and ensure inclusive growth. Courses this spring include Meet the Moment, Fighting Anti-Semitism and Building a Just World, and Dismantling Racism from the Inside Out. The JEDI plus JSSJ program is built around your busy schedule, driven by your individual professional development, and steeped in a rich culture rooted in justice. Learn more and apply at usfca.edu/JEDI.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 464, Judeo-Futurism. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Libenson.
And I'm Lex Rofeberg.
And today we're going to be talking about something you may never have heard of, Judeo-Futurism. Judeo-Futurism is a combination of scholarship, culture, practice, and art through which Jews can envision and build a generative future. According to our guest today, it's a way of linking past, present, future, grief, and hope all together in one messy but essential conversation. Our guest today, Becca Leviss, is going to help us take a deeper dive. And if you want to take an even deeper dive, you can register for the class she'll be teaching in our Unyeshiva Center for Jewish Learning and Unlearning, which starts in just a few days on January 7th, in which you'll study the ideas behind Afrofuturism and consider how they might help us develop concepts of Judeo-Futurism. And you'll co-create Judeo-Futurist practices to channel into the world. You can sign up for the class and for any of our other Unyeshiva mini-courses by heading to judaismunbound.com/classes. By the time you listen to next week's episode of Judaism Unbound, these classes will already have started, so don't wait. Honestly, you may want to pause me talking right now so that you can hop over to the website, register, and then come back. Financial aid is available for all of our classes from each of their registration pages. So that's judaismunbound.com/classes, and we'll be here when you get back. Well, hopefully now you're all set and registered for one or more of our amazing Unyeshiva classes. Awesome. So our guest today, Becca Leviss, is currently a candidate for a master's in theological studies at Harvard Divinity School, where she explores the intersection of religion, ethics, and politics. Prior to her time at Harvard, Becca Leviss helped build the fundraising team at Protect Democracy, a leading nonprofit in the U.S. democracy movement. Her undergraduate experience in sociology and research analysis at Tufts University included several research projects around philanthropy, religion, youth civic engagement, and racial justice. The topic of Judeo-Futurism sounds right up our alley here at Judaism Unbound. So, Becca Leviss, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you. It's so exciting to be here.
Well, let's start in a really basic place. For people like me who enjoy science fiction, for whom that's a big part of their life, I think we hear something like Judeo-Futurism and we're like, yes! And maybe for a lot of people who are not science fiction fans, they hear Judeo-Futurism and they say, that sounds like science fiction. I am not interested in that. So can you help us understand what we're really talking about when we use a word like Judeo-Futurism?
Absolutely. So let's break it down really simply. Judeo-Futurism. Really, the word itself, I sort of borrowed from Shaul Magid, who writes a lot about something called Judeo-pessimism.
We'll link to his episodes in the show notes.
Oh, awesome. Shaul is phenomenal, really brilliant scholar and also mentor and teacher of mine. And Shaul writes a lot about Judeo-pessimism, which borrows from this idea of Afro-pessimism, a framework and understanding which grew out of critical race studies to really understand how Blackness functions in American society and how institutions in American culture really treat Blackness as this sort of non-human other. And Afro-pessimism really operates as a foil to something called Afrofuturism. And I was in class with Shaul one day, and I said, Shaul, I really appreciate Judeo-pessimism. I think it's incredibly compelling. It's really useful to understand, especially the American Jewish experience. And also, it's not enough for me. Where's my Judeo-Futurism? And Shaul turned to me and he said, there isn't one, go build it. And that's when I started thinking and writing a lot about this idea of Judeo-Futurism. With all due respect, though, I'm going to actually say that I think Shaul was wrong. There is Judeo-Futurism. There has been Judeo-Futurism happening for thousands of years. And it's happening right now in all of these disparate pockets, both within American Judaism and sort of global Judaism. We just aren't calling it Judeo-Futurism, which brings me to sort of the idea of what is Judeo-Futurism. My understanding of Judeo-Futurism is this sort of co-created framework for how we envision our future Jewishly. It is not a prescriptive answer of what the Jewish future is going to look like. It's a set of modalities and methodologies through which Jews, particularly American Jews and American Jewish institutions, can be thinking about our future in a way that is more generative, that is more rich, that is more brilliant, with all of the different facets of what it means to be Jewish, not just 10 weeks or 10 years from now, but 100 years from now.
So that's really where I wanted to understand Judeo-Futurism. And maybe a good place to start is by understanding Afrofuturism. What is it in contrast to? So it's in contrast to Judeo or Afro-pessimism, which I take just from the name and the way that you've described it as a kind of, who was it? There was one of those thinkers about Judaism that talked about, I think it was Salo Baron maybe, who talked about the lachrymose history, or somehow that the Jews are always sad about the past and maybe by extension sad about the present and future. Is it really a more optimistic take, or is it really about saying it's optimistic, or it aspires to be optimistic, but it's also rigorous, meaning it's not messianic. It's not saying, oh, one day things will be better, but it's saying, what can we really do to bring about that better future? And it's a more intentional approach, or what makes futurism, Judeo or Afro, what makes it that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's incredibly important. This is what I've learned from futurists I've spoken to and worked with. There are actually no experts in the future. None of us are experts in the future because actually none of us know what's going to happen. Really, any type of futurism work is inherently co-created and co-designed. And so I think I'm going to start there. And that's why I'm trying to be really careful with Judeo-Futurism not being prescriptive. It is not an answer, it is a process. And I think that's a very intentional difference that I'm really trying to press on. So to sort of answer your question about what Afrofuturism is, arguably Afrofuturism has been happening for hundreds of years. The official term of Afrofuturism was coined by a journalist named Mark Derry in the 1990s. It's basically this aesthetic and literary movement focusing on the intersection of Black history, Black culture, science fiction, technology. As you sort of reference to science fiction, it typically appears in sort of modes of speculative fiction. Afrofuturism is a movement that reckons with trauma and horrific histories and violent histories, sort of allowing Black American communities to pay homage to the past while sort of metabolizing it and looking towards a generative reimagined future. One of the most classic modern examples of Afrofuturism is Black Panther and the Black Panther movies. And I point to that a lot to say that I don't think futurism is necessarily utopic and blindly optimistic, nor should it be. If you look to the film of the Black Panther, there are pretty big problems there, right? Problems around resources, around climate, around art and power, all of these big, deep questions that are core to what it means to be human and to be in relationship to other humans and to the world around us. Those questions never leave. Similarly, I don't think Judeo-Futurism is this blindly optimistic world where everything is great in what it means to be Jewish. What I am trying to do with the framework of Judeo-Futurism is to break us out of this box. And when I say us, I mean sort of American Jewish institutions and American Jewry, understanding that even to say that is to cast really broad generalizations about communities that are not monolithic. I would like to break us out of this box of what it means to both recreate and reimagine our past, to understand our present, and then to imagine a future.
To me, I would like to live in a world where the word futurist were not needed because everybody was just one. It was like what it meant to be human. Like, I would like to live in a world where, like, just as we relate to our past and think about whether it's genealogical ancestors or mythic ancestors, our inherited narratives, like, just as we look backwards at our past, we just as much look forward into our future and see ourselves as being in deep relationship to our future. To me, that's just like a basic thing. I think if you asked random people on the street, like, hey, random person on the street, do you think we should care about the future inhabitants of this planet, or like our descendants, and I don't mean descendants just like our children and their children, I mean like collectively the people that will be around after us, like should we care about those people? I think most folks on the street would say absolutely, yes. But then if you were to talk to them about the term futurism or futurology, that would feel like a very sideline thing that like maybe when we're done studying all the stuff related to what exists right now and what has existed in the past, when we're all set on those fronts, we can look into the future. And I think it relates to what you said, which is that nobody can be an expert in the future in the sense of knowing what is going to happen. Even the term futurology that sometimes people use, like ology is a suffix meaning the knowledge of. And like you can't, it's not true to say that like any of us has knowledge of the future. But I think we're actually really screwed as a society. Like I'm thinking about climate change, any number of other things. Like we are so fundamentally impoverished as a collective because we are rendering futurism a sideline issue. We are treating it as like there's stuff urgent right now. And there is. But when every year we say over and over again, things are urgent, it just means that we don't ever address issues that can only be addressed in the big span as opposed to the small span. So you've given us a little bit of a what is futurism. That's my like, why does it matter? What's your why does this matter on a Judeo-Futurism front?
We are already living in someone else's future. And people right now are imagining the next 50 to 100 years of the world we're living in, whether we participate in that or not. It is happening whether we make ourselves have agency and power in the process of co-creation or not. And I think about a lot specifically in the idea of Judeo-Futurism and a lot of what I'm writing about separately and thinking about ideas of Christian eschatology, which is sort of Christian ideals and concepts around the ends of the world, is there are lots of people right now outside of the Jewish community who are thinking about how the Jewish community is going to exist in the next 100 to 200 to thousands of years. That is happening without us. And I'm not saying that we necessarily need to actively participate in those conversations, but the generative practices and policies that are coming out of those conversations are going to affect us. I would like to imagine what my Judeo-Futurism is going to look like, not just the idea of Christian apocalypse. And that's why, Dan, to your question of, is it messianic or not? I think part of it is, part of it doesn't have to be. This also speaks to another bell that I am continually trying to ring, which is, I don't think Judeo-Futurism is that radical or new. I do think American Judaism, particularly American Jewish institutions, are phenomenal at thinking about the past. And we have so much of the capacity for Jewish imagination is phenomenal. I am continually blown away by the capacity for American Jewish institutions to cultivate imagination. What I feel is a lost opportunity is the fact that so much of that imagination is retrospective. So much of that energy is spent around recreating a past, either a past that is in itself marred by trauma and violence, and or is lost to us because of trauma and violence. I think those efforts are incredibly important, and I also think they're not enough. But they show to me the amount of resources and energy around storytelling and art and literature, all of this push right now we're seeing around reinvigorating diasporic Judaism, right? So the push back towards Yiddishkeit, that people are learning Ladino in schools now. Like, this shows me the beautiful capacity we have for imagination and recreation. We absolutely should continue to do that. And also that for me is a data point that we have the capacity to also do that and have it be forward-looking. I am a fan of the phrase that the prophets were futurists. I think some of the earliest proof points of Judeo-Futurism we have are prophetic literature, right? Ezekiel is sitting on the banks of the river after the Jews have been kicked out of Jerusalem with the fall of the temple. And he has this almost magical vision of these winged beings with single legs pulling the chariot of God through the sky. There are people, and I say this as a person who is deeply religious, like there are religious motifs in that. People will look at that as the prophet Ezekiel. Other people will interpret that as people interpreting the words of the prophet Ezekiel. Other sort of secular biblical historians will say this is just a story that people made up. But whatever interpretation you're going to have about that, it is a way sort of speculative fiction and a type of futurist reimagining of what ritual looks like, what Jewish community looks like, what Jewish religious leadership looks like after this massive seismic shift. And so what I am trying to say is I actually don't think I'm pushing anything that crazy or that out there. What I'm trying to say is how can we take capacities that we have been demonstrating and building as a Jewish community for millennia, practices that are happening already in disparate pockets. I know you all had Charlie from Lair House on a couple months ago on your podcast. I would argue that you could interpret Lair House as a type of futurist reimagining of what Jewish ritual space looks like. And so my point is, not only have Judeo-Futurist practices been going on for thousands of years, they're also happening now in all of these different places throughout our country. What I am trying to do by coining this framework of Judeo-Futurism is how we can bring all of these different modalities and practices and framings into one collective, multidisciplinary conversation about co-creating a Jewish future.
So this is spectacular. I want to talk about a Torah portion. Weird move, Lex.
You're the rabbi.
A little while back, I know every once in a while I do rabbi stuff. It's annoying. A little while back in the Torah cycle, we hit in Genesis this portion famously called Chaye Sarah. Chaye Sarah is called the life of Sarah, and it begins with Sarah dying. The entire Torah portion is all about her descendants. It's all about the next generation, including your namesake, Rebecca. But Isaac, Rebecca, what's gorgeous about that, I mean, practically, it was called Chaye Sarah because that's like the first phrase in the Torah portion. I don't think it was all that thoughtful by the authors. But what you're left with is a Torah portion that makes the implicit point that it is, in fact, talking about Sarah when you are talking about the generations that come after Sarah. It is, in fact, not external to Sarah what happens from her descendants. And that to me is a very futuristic notion. Like part of why I'm interested in futurism is very selfish. And part of why I'm connected to Judaism at all is very selfish. Like, point me to another realm of human experience where in 1,000 years, there are people that will care about groups I was a part of. I can't really think of, like, Jewish, I'll explain what I mean. Like, Jewishly, right now, I am invested, I am interested in, for all the reasons you talked about with looking backward and the past, I am actually connected to, I care about people who lived 2,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago. I actually think about them regularly. I don't think about all of them individually, but I relate to people in different corners of the world that were Jewish at different times. I sort of reinvigorate their memory each time I do so, I would argue. I kind of would like people in 1,000 years or 2,000 years to be like, I care about Jews in the United States in the 21st century. I'm reading a thing about them. I'm connecting to liturgy that they wrote. That's nice to think that we would be sort of collectively memorialized in that way. And in order to do that, you have to be in the long game. You have to be in the conversation, both with 2,000 years in the past and with 2,000 years in the future. Because if we don't do ourselves the 2,000 years in the past work, then we're not modeling for our 2,000 years in the future friends that they should be doing that towards us, if that makes sense. And so that's all from Chaye Sarah, that we have this notion that actually to do futurism is not only to think about others and to think about that which is separate from us. I actually think it's a way of committing to the act of Jewish memory moving forward.
So I think that is absolutely right. And I'm also going to push back a little bit. I'll do same language, same parsha, right? So Chaye Sarah. I also love Chaye Sarah. I see it as a really fascinating example of how trauma lives on across generations if it is not properly acknowledged and grieved. So, so much of Midrash is around the fact that Sarah dies in part because of the binding of Isaac, because she thinks that Abraham is trying to kill her son. And there are many people far smarter than me who will, yes, he was. And there's some disagreement on this, but that is one pretty strong interpretation of it. And that part of the reason Abraham then sends his servant out to find Rebekah for Isaac is because he wants someone to comfort his son now that his mother is gone. So there's a very interesting direct line that you can trace from the binding of Isaac to the death of Sarah to Abraham sending out his servant to get Rebekah, who is then taken from her family and her home, brought to a strange land with a bunch of strangers, to care for this man who, by all accounts in the Parsha, is clearly undergoing deep trauma, right? When Rebekah encounters Isaac, he is in a field, sort of meditating, dreaming, weeping. We're not really sure. I think she is veiled, and one of the interpretations of what it means that Rebekah is veiled when she meets Isaac is actually that Rebekah encounters Isaac and puts up this internal veil to protect herself. So it's actually not just a physical veil, but a emotional veil of she needs to protect herself from this man who clearly is traumatized not only by the actions of his father, but by the impact it had and the loss of his mother. And so I see Sarah, yes, as your interpretation, this fascinating and important reminder of the way generations and generations build on each other and the importance of looking both past and where we are and forward simultaneously. And for me, I understand it as well as a lesson of what it means when we move forward without properly acknowledging and creating space for the past. And why I find Afrofuturism a compelling framework to draw from when it comes to Judeo-Futurism is the way in which I understand Afrofuturism to be almost a metabolic process. This sort of metabolism of the past, a past that is both co-constructed with and damaged by violence and oppression, like unspeakable violence and oppression, that then is both carried forward into the future, is not ignored when you think about the future, but is not the barrier to the future. Unfortunately, what I encounter both anecdotally and in some of my research when it comes to typically, mainstream American Jewish institutions is that when we think about the past, we do so with such beautiful, respectful detail. And then it almost serves as a blockage to really let us use that same imaginative capacity to think about the future. And what ends up happening is this idea of an American Jewish future is a future in which there are American Jews, full stop. And obviously, I want that. I am a Jewish American. I would like there to be American Jews in the future. And also, that's not enough for me. I need more than that. I actually want to know what ritual is going to look like with the rise of technology. I want to know how climate change, which disproportionately is going to affect American Jews, given the fact that American Jews primarily live on the coast of the US, I want to know how that's going to affect my religious practice, my connection to Jewish communities in DC and New York and Boston and Florida. Like all of these big questions, I want to be able to use this incredible imaginative capacity to start to solve and envision.
I want to get super practical. You just started by talking about climate change. I want to get super practical about understanding what it might look like to view the world through the lens of Judeo-Futurism that you want us to do. When I think about Judeo-Futurism, I feel like there's a way in which I'm trying to practice Judeo-Futurism as I understand it, but I'm also conscious of ways in just listening to you talking that I'm not. So an example of how I think that I am is that lately, and not everybody who works with me agrees with this framing, but lately I've been talking about, the way that the American Jewish community institutions tend to think about the future and what they're trying to do is they're saying, hey, look, and I don't think they're doing this consciously or actively, but they're essentially saying, hey, look, there's, 14 million Jews in the world. If we could make it so that in 100 years from now, there are still 14 million Jews in the world, that would be a huge win. And I'm thinking about it as like, can you imagine if there would be maybe 1 billion Jews in the world? Like, what would have to happen for there to be 1 billion Jews in the world? That would be a profoundly different 100 years or however long it might take than one that is meant to try to preserve 14 million. Probably the only way to get to 1 billion Jews would be a risky path. So I'm curious what some of the real, when you think about it, what are the really specific ways that you think people might think differently if they were thinking in the Judeo-Futurist way that you are imagining. And then the other thing that I'm not doing this rigorously. And I understand and I hear you saying that it's not really necessarily about the substance primarily or even at all. It's really about a rigorous approach to doing this work. And I guess I'm curious, what would it look like for me to be doing this work more rigorously with a process that would be not just kind of throwing out speculative ideas like a billion Jews?
I understand Judeo-Futurism and why I borrow from both Afrofuturism and other more technical processes and practices of futures thinking is because I think we actually need a bit of all of it, in the hopes that that can give people a starting point of modalities that they can borrow and use. And then my hope is, again, because there are no experts in the future, my hope is that students also bring their own and we get to co-create that together. So I'm thinking about what Judeo-Futurism looks like both inside and outside the academy, inside and outside the shul, inside and outside the boardroom. I think first there's some scholarship. There's some type of learning we need to do. I say that learning happens in the academy and the yeshiva, right? So there's a place for deep academic critical theory. Afrofuturism as a discipline has a lot of scholarship behind it. I would love to get some Judeo-Futurist scholarship out there. And then also the yeshiva, right? So what is Judeo-Futurist theology? I mentioned prophetic literature. The Talmud similarly has all of these practices for what it means to build something beyond just a 18 to 24 month timeline. Is there sort of theological religious scholarship that we can be doing around that? The second piece, so the first piece is scholarship. Second piece is practice. I think that means both ritual practice and strategic practice. Ritual practice, I think some of the most innovative stuff is happening on the West Coast. You have organizations that are really trying to reincorporate the environment and ecology into Jewish ritual. Things like psychedelics and cannabis and technology and how that is reshaping Jewish ritual. I think that is a sort of a box of exploration and rigor I think we could have there. And then I also think strategic practice, which is, Dan, what you alluded to of what would it look like to have a strategic plan to have 1 billion Jews worldwide in 100 years. And for that, I am drawing on methodology called strategic foresight, which has been typically used by national security experts and business leaders and technologists to identify future challenges and opportunities based on various anticipated views of the world and world building scenarios and what each one, these are all sort of neutral, not one is good, not one is bad, sort of neutral world scenarios, and how each of them presents unique challenges and opportunities. And to do that, I'm really building on some of my past work and current work with organizations within the US, particularly one org called Democracy 2076, that has been doing a lot of research, thinking, and organizing around what it means for the US democracy ecosystem to be thinking on a 50-year timeline and what it means to actually build campaigns and strategic plans around that longer timeline. And then the final piece of all of this, again, scholarship, practice, and then I think you have art and aesthetics. And that's really where I'm drawing on a lot of Afrofuturism. I think artists give us an ability to break out of our more normative intellectual modes of sense-making. And I say sense-making, both intellectual sense-making and also embodied sense-making. Art gives us the space to encounter things we might not encounter otherwise and envision and live things we might not envision and live otherwise. And I believe there is a reason why, right after the election or anytime there is a seismic crisis moment, people post poetry rather than punditry. And I think that is just one example for how art allows us to reorient ourselves beyond other capacities for meaning making. And therefore, any type of Judeo-Futurist framework, in my mind, has to center itself in art and aesthetics.
So Dan used a word in his last question that I want to really flag and that I was sitting with. And you used it in the perfect way because I think it's how a lot of society used it. You said speculative. And you were talking about, like, I don't do this rigorously. I throw out these speculative ideas. I think that's how a lot of us in colloquial speech use the word speculative. And I think there's a way in which it is like a self-marginalizing term. To call something speculation in a courtroom is actually like an objection, right? Like you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to have hard and fast evidence for whatever it is that you're saying. I love speculative fiction. You're talking about art and aesthetics. We've talked on the show about like speculative fiction being not just like a sidebar effort, but maybe one of the core ingredients of how we're gonna theory of change the futures of Judaism. Like in order to create Jewish futures, you have to start by envisioning them. Speculative fiction, I mean, in that realm, it's not marginalizing. I think people talk about speculative fiction as like a very deep and important kind of literature. But then we go and talk about stuff as, oh, that's just speculation. I'm just throwing out my speculation. That's a way of saying it's less data driven. The real thing I want to sit with, though, is I'm interested in, like you were talking about, the devastating downsides of our Jewish universe that is so good at holding past and the traumas of the past, the violence of the past, and is less good looking into the future or prioritizing future Jews, future world in our decision making. And what I want to get at is another just colloquialism. People talk about my grandparents would roll over in their grave if we did X. Often X being if we changed something about Judaism, if we did something radical and new. My grandparents would roll over in their grave, like we would be discarding, we'd be in effect directly looking our ancestors in the face and saying like, screw you, if we discard or shift what they loved. And I often want to say to them, like, what would the theoretical future descendants of ours roll over in their one-day graves for us not creating? If that makes it, like, if people getting all countercultural in the 60s and 70s, and you talked about psychedelics, blending psychedelics in Judaism and creating the Jewish renewal movement, or bringing feminism into Judaism, like, there were lots of people at the time who said, like, our ancestors would roll over in their graves if there were women rabbis. But if you and I and all of us inhabited a world in 2024 where those things hadn't happened, our Jewish world would be so much worse. And yet we don't really privilege that. We don't privilege what people in 2100 would be devastated to not have. We privilege what people who died in 1950 would be devastated if it disappeared. I'm curious your thoughts on that. And I'm also just like wondering if you would identify particular Jewish methodologies or ideas that help us do some of that shifting work. For me, it's the Shemitah and Jubilee cycle, the 7-year and 49-year cycles that sort of force us to think beyond just our now. But I'm curious if you have others.
That's an excellent example. And this is something I am sitting with, is the way in which time operates differently in Judaism, as opposed to more Christian hegemonic Western time, which is very linear. Jewish time spiral. It's a spiral. And that means our relationship to past, present, and future is different. It exists in different dimensions on different planes. And so when we are thinking about the future intellectually and also spatially, how does thinking about time as a spiral actually change our relationship to it? To your point about what we should take with us, what we should leave behind, Crash Theory says this much better than I ever could, and I know
which is B'nai Lappi's framework for those who aren't familiar. We'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah,
too.
Which is articulated so beautifully and much better than I can right now. But I'll just give 2 examples that I'm thinking of really actively in my work right now, which all go back to this idea that if American Jewish institutions fail to listen to American Jewish communities, they're going to get left behind. And I say this as someone who, I am the person I am because of American Jewish institutions. I would not be so devoted to both my faith and my community and what it means to be a person existing in the world and doing good in the world if it weren't for American Jewish institutions. And I worry that there is this growing disparity between what American Jewish individuals need and what the institutions are willing to give them. I'll just name 2 examples. One is I was having a very interesting conversation with a rabbi a couple weeks ago who used to work at a congregation that had been hemorrhaging members for years and years and years. And I share this as one example. I don't think this is a unique example. So this could be pretty much any rabbi in any major city anywhere in the US, hemorrhaging members, and had a pretty dilapidated synagogue. The synagogue chose to raise, I think, either $5 or $10 million, whatever price tag, and put every penny of that into revitalizing the building and not a cent towards membership, and engagement programs and staffing, none of it. And I think this is actually indicative of a larger trend. I could tell you like 3 or 4 more of these very similar stories in which Jewish institutions are prioritizing buildings over their actual members. And what I worry is that 50 years from now, we're going to have a lot of Jewish buildings and no Jews inside of them. Another example, which I've been reading about a lot with Lila Corwin Berman's work around the American Jewish Philanthropic Complex. And I know she was on your show a couple months ago recently, right?
Not a couple months ago, but multiple times. And she's also a past teacher in the Onion Yeshiva. So this is lovely. It's a 3-week mini course teacher citing another 3-week mini course teacher.
As someone who sometimes gets bogged down by the wonkiness of academic writing, Lila's work is incredibly accessible and just really sharp and really well written. And so she writes about the American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, and particularly the rise in the 1940s and 50s of massive endowments in Jewish philanthropies and Jewish federations. And so remember, when quote unquote American Jewish philanthropy really started, it started essentially as a system of mutual aid networks. So you have mainly Eastern European Jewish immigrants coming who established themselves, found jobs and housing, and formed shuls and communities, and this whole sort of secondary immigrant economy. And then the second wave came, and part of the foundation of so many of these Jewish philanthropic organizations was for the first generation to care for the second, both in terms of financial resources, but also like informational resources, knowing which neighborhoods to live in, what schools to go to, where the kosher butcher was and who you could trust. Like that was, in my understanding, the foundation of American Jewish philanthropy. And then in the 40s and 50s, particularly in the shadow of the Holocaust, you see this really shift to the accumulation and the holding on to of financial resources. These resources are being held onto for some amorphous, intangible future emergency that is going to come. So I have one of the quotes written right here, which is talking about the New York Federation Board that established this massive endowment for the day when the emergency needs that they were designed to serve will have presented themselves, which is basically a very fancy way in the 40s and 50s of them saying, we don't know what, but something bad might happen, and we want money to protect us when it does.
I love you. Tomorrow, you're always a day away.
Precisely. And I realize I'm saying this a little jokingly, a little flippantly. And I want to be clear, I actually don't think it's funny at all. I think it's really serious and really important. One of the greatest proof points in my mind about Jewish imagination is how good American Jews are when it comes to sensing danger. There's a reason why in 2015, when Trump was rising to power, so many American Jews were saying, this guy sounds familiar. This stuff sounds familiar to us. We're worried about this. I think American Jewish institutions were some of the earliest institutions that, and obviously like Black communities, communities of color, Indigenous communities, sort of ringing the alarm bells that what was happening was not normal. That is good futurism, to be clear. That is fantastic future imagination, but that's not building things. And so what I am continually trying to do, and apologies if I sound like I'm beating a dead horse here, I want us to figure out what it means to envision a future that is beyond just tragedy and beyond trauma. And so many examples in American Jewish individual life and institutional life show that we have the ability to do so.
This whole conversation is making me think of something that happened just about 4 years ago at Limmud, UK. We were at this conference, Limmud, which is a Jewish learning conference, and it was in the UK, which is kind of the mothership of this thing. And I was at this session, I think Lex was there too, where it was like a panel, and I don't remember exactly what the framing was, but one of the panelists was saying, I have a list of like 10 things that could happen in the future that Jewish thinking ought to take account of. And I remember that one of them was if there would be an epidemic disease or a new disease that would kill children. And I remember being horrified to hear about that. But I was like, as soon as he said it, I was like, yes, of course. I mean, of course, that is a thing that could happen. And if we haven't given it any thought, then we're not going to be ready to deal with it. And then like 2 months later came COVID. And it was just something that the Jewish community and all communities really were pretty darn unprepared for. So I understand that that's different from what you're talking about in terms of building things, but I just offer it in the spirit of some of these things that seem far-fetched or speculative or long-term future actually could happen almost literally tomorrow. But that raises for me this question of time horizon. And when I think about futurism, I tend to be thinking about, for example, I don't know if it was Ezekiel or Ezra, somebody during the Babylonian exile had a vision of a return to the land, right? And another temple being rebuilt, like a whole new thing that was going to exist. And we think of it now, and maybe they thought of it then as a return to the past. But the reality is that it was a profoundly new way of being Jewish. And once we're talking about that, I mean, we can't, I think, not mention, I think, what is the most successful in the sense of scale of impact and scale of change futurist project in recent Jewish history, which is Zionism, right? Which is very similar to the project of the Jews in the Babylonian exile who said, we have a great new idea. I guess what I'm wondering about, though, is that what is common to them is that they take place in the land of Israel. And I know that what you're really interested in talking about is what would a futurist orientation towards the Jews in the diaspora look like? And I'm wondering if we can and should be thinking in these sort of grand ways, like I was thinking about 1 billion Jews, or alternatively, can we and should we really be thinking on a shorter time horizon? Because frankly, even that would be a step in the right direction from my perspective. Like I think a lot of Jewish planning is really, again, just more or less, how can we stop ourselves from losing what we have, as opposed to how can we build something really new, even if we're only talking about the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question, right? And every time I have this conversation about Judeo-Futurism, it's a matter of time before someone brings up Zionism. Part of what I might argue is I don't know to what extent Zionism as a lived political actuality is actually so Judeo-Futurist. And that is not a moral judgment on Zionism's feasibility or viability. It is simply just from a framework standpoint. I don't know if we can actually put Zionism as it exists in the current project of the nation state of Israel as a Judeo-Futurism.
I'm talking more about the Zionism of 100 years ago.
Yeah, well, so then I think my question is, okay, if that isn't Judeo-Futurist, what is? Right? Like what would be a Judeo-Futurist Zionism? What would it be like to imagine a Jewish connection to a particular land, understanding things like climate change, understanding changing technology? One of these scenarios that is imagined in many strategic foresight models is a backlash against current trends around overconsumption and commercialism, materialism, to a deeply intentional use of resources where personal gain is actually suspended in favor of personal responsibility. I would be really curious to think about how those predicted trends, and again, none of us are experts on the future. We have no idea the viability or likelihood of any of these scenarios, but I genuinely am curious how different understandings of resources like capital, like land, like water, like electricity would change how we as American Jews understand relationships to the land of Israel, what the viability of a one-state or two-state solution would look like. And so what I am asking is, if we instead step out of current conversations, which are pretty much day by day narrowing even more until like, how do we get through the next 2 weeks, let alone the next 2 years? What I'm trying to see is how can we change the angle and change the questions through and from which we are approaching this issue, and what does that unlock for us? Lex, I want to go back to your question about speculation. There is a world in which speculation, speculative, means something without a lot of evidence. It kind of sort of a hodgepodge of theories. It might be conspiracy theories. It might be ridiculous. It's not very, very weighty or to be taken seriously. And I think there's also a world in which speculation is actually a very serious understanding or theory. It just acknowledges a risk. And so I wonder to what extent we can view speculation and this idea of speculative stories, speculative imagination, as not necessarily something that is illegitimate or invalid, but something that is inherently uncertain. And with that carries a degree of risk, and particularly a risk of loss of identity, of resources, of life, of so many things. The challenge for us, I see this for me in my work, I see this in the class as well, I see this in whatever this Judeo-Futurist project looks like moving forward, is to ask people to enter into this process of speculation requires them to enter a space of uncertainty and to take on some risk of loss. And our challenge then is, how do we create the community and the holding space to guide people through that uncertainty as a collective community of practice?
Yeah, I mean, I did want to sit a little with the Zionism piece, because I think you bring up an important distinction. And Dan, when you said, I'm more talking about the Zionism of 100 years ago, I actually think that's like a really pivotal key point. We use the word Zionism and we talk about like the history of Zionism, but I think in many ways there's like basic breaking points on the timeline of what Zionism is and means. One of them would be when it was, to use the word, speculative or imaginative versus when it was pragmatic. It's a totally, like, if I were around in the 1910s and 20s, I mean, I'm speaking as somebody who is not a Zionist. My own genealogical grandparents who were around and cared at that point in time were also not Zionists. Like, I don't think I would have been a Zionist at that point. And I would have absolutely, if I were the me that is alive now, I would have absolutely wanted to participate in the grand conversations that were futurist conversations about what Zionism is. I mean, you had Theodor Herzl with political Zionism as an idea. You had Achad Ha'am, forms of cultural Zionism that wouldn't be anchored on a state. You had Buber over here. You had Jabotinsky over here. I mean, not a Jabotinsky guy. I'm not saying he's super great, but like you had a conversation with like really expansive, probably too expansive, but like very expansive boundaries, to use a word that's core to our show, Unbound. Like, and I would have wanted to be in that, because at any given moment in Jewish history, I would have wanted to be speculating, trying to think about what's next. And so in the 1920s, we wouldn't know in 1920 that in 1948 there's going to be this new thing. We wouldn't know for sure that was happening. But we would know that there are a set of big questions about how Jews organize ourselves globally, diasporically, or not. Should we have sort of a nucleus in one place? Should we not? And that is just a fundamentally different thing from conversations about Zionism now. So many political conversations about what we should do, where do we go from here, start with like, look, we have to work from material realities of now. And that's true. I'm not saying those have no place in the world. Like this isn't a conversation that is anti-nowism. This is a conversation that's for filling the gap of futurism. Conversations about what Jewishly is, like what the Jewish realities are right now, and how do we futz with them? How do we improve upon them? How do we make sustaining innovations, to use a term from the very beginning of our podcast, are different. They're just like a whole different zone from how do we think Jewishly about what is not yet. I find that whenever I bring up to a rabbi in a synagogue or a federation exec, or even just like a person who lives in a Jewish community, and I say like, let's talk about the future of Judaism, the response is just like, well, here in our community, we have this situation and that wouldn't really work. And we have like, I guess, what are some of the obstacles standing in the way of us being able to have these conversations? Because you've made a compelling case. I still think that folks are listening and are probably like, this is so awesome, but like, we can't do that here.
Yeah, such a good question. And I think it's important for me to ground this all in saying, I don't see this as a zero-sum game. To your point, Lex, which I think is a really important framing and conversation that has been happening at least for the last 20 years, but certainly for the last, 18 months around, here is our present reality. Let's not go back and debate the question of nation statism and should a country exist. I think that is absolutely where we should be grounding pragmatic political conversations, foreign policy conversations, peace-building conversations. And also we should be thinking about what is more and what is beyond, and not let those conversations be, to use your words, the bounds within which we are crafting both our present and future reality. I see futurism, and particularly Judeo-Futurism, as a muscle. I was an athlete in my past life, but how I think it goes is you don't just train one muscle, right? If you just train one muscle, all of your other muscles atrophy and you can't actually do what you're trying to do. So I used to play tennis pretty seriously in a past life. And in tennis, you are training your quick twitch muscles because you're moving very fast over the court. You're changing direction quickly. You're tightening your core because actually a lot of tennis comes from like torso rotation. You're working your arms, you're working your quads. There's also a mental strategy piece because so much of tennis is a mental game. I can't imagine you have many sports metaphors on this podcast, but all of which—
How dare you?
Lex loves
We
them.
have many of them, and I always want more. And I am ready to talk about love, and deuce, and topspin, and side spin, and metaphor that onto the Jewish present and future all day. And we will someday, Becca, before Mashiach comes.
Can you hear out? So may it be God's will. All of which to say is these are all different muscles. And I'm not saying we ignore any of them. What I'm saying is right now, American Jewish institutions have a couple really good muscles and have shown me that they have the capacity to strengthen other complementary muscles that will help them do all of this work better. What I see this Judeo-Futurist framework is doing is really building and honing that muscle and doing that collectively.
So we're closing this episode, which is a funny thing to do to a conversation about the future. It doesn't really close by definition. But I am curious as we close, like, we haven't done, and I'm glad, we haven't done, like, what is the week by week going to be? What's going to happen? I am curious for those who have listened and been like, this is such a cool conversation. How does it translate into, like, a 3-week experience? What will this look like for me? And to get really grand, as is appropriate, I'm also curious, like, just what do you want folks leaving this podcast, for those who won't take your class, sitting with? What questions might they be asking? How might they shift their lens in some small way, even if they don't quite take that 3-week class?
So I really hope they do. I would like to invite you all into my sandbox and start to build this together. The course roughly is going to go over those 3 main parts of my own conception of a Judeo-Futurist framework. First, what is the scholarship of Judeo-Futurism? So we're going to draw a little bit on Afrofuturism, a little bit on Judeo-Pessimism, try to figure out what are some smart, thoughtful ideas out there about what it means to do future work Jewishly. Week 2 is going to focus on the aesthetics and art of Judeo-Futurism. So we're going to look at some music, we're going to look at more traditional Jewish crafts, how various Jewish artists are reimagining and envisioning a Jewish future, and sort of start to think about what aesthetic aspects of our own lives and our own Jewish practice that we want to reimagine as Judeo-Futurist. And the 3rd week is sort of this practice of Judeo-Futurism, which is a practice that is both strategic, like I said, is based in these models of strategic foresight, and also religious. And so we're going to take some time to reimagine ritual and sort of the pragmatic Jewish future using some of these frameworks and creating these frameworks together. And my hope is that this is sort of a 3-week taste. I am continuing to do this work both in my capacity at Harvard Divinity School and hopefully beyond. So I really just want to start to cultivate this community of practice and this collective hive mind of folks who care deeply about this work, are excited to learn from and with each other around what it means to really do Judeo-Futurism. And in terms of what people leaving this episode should think about, I would love you all to think about what it means to take a rigorous Judeo-Futurist approach to how you're living your own lives, how you're understanding both your Jewish identity and your Jewish community. Think about what a Jewish future could look like beyond trauma and harm and suffering. That is one of the largest obstacles we have to what it means to really build a rich and generative Jewish future. And the final thing that I would love to leave folks with, I come to this work as a person of faith, as someone who cares deeply about religion and particularly American Judaism. And I think often, particularly in more progressive, intellectual leftist spaces, we think about religion and organized religion as something that is inherently traditional and lowercase c conservative and really buried and trapped in the past. I think some of the most transformative moments of future visioning and moral imagination have and continue to occur within religious communities. Because I think to be someone who identifies as religious is to express this sort of reorientation towards stepping outside normative bounds of what is and what will be. To the extent that you all are bought into futurism, I would ask you to take one step further and say, what does it actually mean to include religion and Judaism in a futurist practice?
Thank you so much, Becca Leviss, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much. It was fabulous.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. For those of you who listened and you're like, wait a second, Becca Leviss, incredible podcast guest. I bet she's also a really incredible teacher. I want to take her class. That's a really good takeaway. Here's what you do. You head to JudaismUnbound.com/classes. Head there, register for Becca Leviss's awesome class on Judeo-Futurism. There is financial aid available for anybody who needs it. Just apply on her registration page. And you're going to learn amazing things. You're going to meet some awesome people who want to be part of a community devoted to Judeo-Futurism. It's not something to miss. Also, we have 3 other classes beginning very, very soon as this episode is released. Becca's starts in just a few days, by the way, and so do these other classes. So you don't want to hesitate. Register now for any of these 4 January mini courses. So we hope that as the new year turns from 2024 to 2025, you take on some new Jewish learning and unlearning through the Onion Yeshiva. Now's as good a time as ever to dive in, or if you've done so before, continue your Onion Yeshiva learning. Also, as we close this episode, we hope that you'll be in touch with us with any questions you have about the Onion Yeshiva or about this episode, anything else related to our work. Just be in touch through one of the following platforms. There's our social media, Facebook and Instagram. Our handles are @JudaismUnbound. There's our email addresses, dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. And we're also so grateful when you go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode, all sorts of other great resources. Today, we're going to leave it at that. No donation requests or anything along those lines. We just want you to learn and unlearn with us. So with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.